Welcome, family, to the Black Power Media special. This is a special edition where we're going to cover keywords. So I am your host, Dr. Yeli Ichile. This is the Black Power Media crew. These are the staples of the platform. We got our t-shirts on. As you notice, we got some Remix Morning Show t-shirts. We've got some Black Power Media t-shirts. So this is a special occasion. Today, our goal is to pull some key terms out of this bowl, and we're going to try to build some definitions, to offer some definitions of some critical terms that you hear throughout the platform that are used often, critical terms that we need to understand in order to have this analysis that we have. So what I'm going to do as the host is I'm going to pull a term from the bowl, and we're going to take a crack at defining said term. So to my left, we have Brother Kalanji Jamachanga. We have Brother Kamal Franklin. We have Doctors Layla Brown and Doctors CBS. We have Dr. Jared Ball. All of your faves from our channel. And now we're going to get into these terms.
You know, so the doctors on that side.
The segregation.
Okay.
It's only two of y'all.
The proletariat says the attorney.
Okay. Aren't you Esquire?
With the masters.
Right.
Projects.
Okay, here we go.
This is the project over here?
Let's let Dr. Ichile do her job.
That's the project.
It's a black table. Anyway, okay. So our first term is colorism.
Of course.
Who wants to take a stab at colorism? What is it?
Light skins, care to go?
Well, I mean, look, colorism is obviously a leftover of enslavement and colonialism and imperialism, and it's constantly being used to separate us and divide us and provide, avenues for us to fall apart. I don't know. Beyond that,
But I mean, I think the important thing about colorism, which is the same conversation we have about racism or all these other isms, are what it means to have the actual power behind whatever kinds of biases or prejudices you might have, right? So, I don't give a fuck if you don't like me because I'm black or because I'm brown skinned, but if you have the power to change the outcome or the material conditions of my life, that's when it matters. So it's not just about these sort of like preferential leanings or whatever, but it actually is about how that impacts our sort of material daily conditions, right?
I would only add, I think for our community, it's about trying to understand how some of us benefit because of the ability, because we're closer to whiteness, let's say, and so the ability to get more, to do more, to be accepted in the larger society more. And then the question becomes, how do those of us who may have what's called light skin privilege fight back against that, right? Or how we don't just fall into the trap of leading our lives of thinking that we can get more because we're light-skinned and that we don't give a fuck about what's happening in our community. So I think for people like me who are light-skinned, I think part of the ethos is making sure that we're doing what we can to struggle against that privilege, to state our role within our larger community and to do the work that we have to do. It doesn't mean that we're more special, but it certainly doesn't mean we're less special. And I think a lot of times I wrap up and say that, on the opposite, and I think sometimes people assume that we do this work because of our light-skinnedness, which I think is a travesty, because then people are not counting the politics that goes into why we want to fight for black liberation or fight for black self-determination. So.
I think it's important to note that it's also gendered. I really feel like women bear the brunt of colorism because in particular societies, primarily the Caribbean and places like Brazil, if a dark-skinned male and you have money, you can sort of marry up in ways that it's exceedingly difficult for women to transcend the stigma and also the social location of being dark-skinned, especially being extremely dark-skinned. And so we also need to just keep in mind that there's other sort of cross-cutting cleavages, so to speak, that also exacerbate or contravene the effects of colorism.
Including texturism.
Period.
Yeah, we were just having a conversation about how texturism plays a part in and is really directly related to, interconnected with colorism. And I think there is something in what you were saying, Dr. CBS, about how it's almost like the lighter skinned end of that spectrum is related to femininity. And softness. And then the darker end of the spectrum is like ideal masculinity. So darker skinned men they do have the ability to, move up, or there's a mobility because it's like an acceptable masculinity associated with darkness, and the femininity that is ascribed to lighter skinned women. Darker skinned women are pushed farther and farther away or outside of acceptable femininity or beauty.
Could you all quickly just say something about what you mean by texturism? I mean, it seems like we introduced a new term in our discussion.
Yeah,
so I just want to be clear, sure everybody's clear.
Texturism really is about preference for hair textures that are where the coil pattern, literally the curl pattern, is a looser curl pattern heading towards straight. So the closer to straight hair that one has, or the looser the texture of the hair, the closer to whiteness essentially you are. And so the tighter your hair texture or the curl of your hair, the closer you are to Africanity or Africanness, blackness. And so it goes the same way that the skin spectrum goes.
But also, again, I think the point that CBS made about how they interact to create different types of realities for different types of people, right? So a part of the conversation that we were having earlier is that someone who might appear, who might actually be a little bit browner because of certain textures might get red in certain ways. And I think that's also true about features too, right? Like, we can have certain people who are dark skinned, but if they have quote unquote, thinner or finer features, and they get red in different types of ways. And I think all of these hair texture, skin color, features are all red on
hair length.
Hair length too, on how we read sort of race and femininity and masculinity all together.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Our next term is revolutionary nationalism.
Kamal, that was yours. Run it.
Well, I'll begin to say that the term was created by Harold Cruz, and it was a term that meant to define nationalism that wasn't narrow nationalism, i.e. nationalism that wasn't about supporting state capitalism, nor wasn't about just taking power for the sake of having black people in positions of power, but nationalism that was defined and connected to a revolutionary struggle in anti-capitalism. So the range of what revolutionary meant was everything from socialism to communism, and it was saying we reject nationalism, that black leadership that just replaces white leadership without having a different economic system is one that will just breed more oppression, and so that's not the type of nationalism that we believe in. And in fact, I would say a lot of the struggles in the 60s and 70s, because this doesn't just apply to black movements, that get labeled are revolutionary nationalist movements. Some of the things that we talk about around even Cuba, Vietnam, and some other places, at their heart were both not only either communist movements, but they were both movements around overturning systems, but based on a certain nationalism that were able to gather people at the bottom range. So it was a struggle for freedom, self-determination, and against oppression and against imperialism and dominance.
When I think about revolutionary nationalism, I think about Lenin. When Lenin talks about the ways that nationalism is a necessary step toward throwing off colonial and imperial structures, but we can't stop there. And so I think that somebody like Amilcar Cabral at the Tricontinental Conference of 1966 picks up on this and talks about how revolutionary nationalism is a stage to move through, but you can't stop there because of the ways that the sentiments of the masses get entrapped by like the state form and entrapped in nationalism that can reproduce extant sort of structures of domination, repression, segmentation, et cetera. And so, and I think that even people like Huey Newton, he moved through revolutionary nationalism to something like revolutionary intercommunalism to show that ultimately the goal is to move beyond the nation state form to continue a sort of a broader and more connected revolutionary struggle.
And I think even beyond the U.S. context, thinking about revolutionary African nationalism is something that I think within the sort of post-World War context, people talk about nationalism as if it is something that is uniquely problematic, that it only has these sort of negative types of qualities. And I think, thinking about what it means to be able to be a self-determined people, it is a necessary step, as you said, and quoting Lenin, that we have to go through. Not to get stuck there, but we also have to recognize that for many formerly colonized or newly colonized peoples, that's a step that we have not actually gone through yet. And so to think about what it means to create that, and I don't know if this will come up later on, but even thinking about the questions around culture, these are all very important things that we have to take into consideration when we think about what it means to belong to some kind of body beyond whatever ethnic group or linguistic group or whatever that supersedes those types of ways of belonging.
For me, revolutionary nationalism is Fanon. It's the Algerian Revolution. You know what I'm saying? It's that total involvement of the people from all levels. For example, just think about like the Battle of Algiers, how they were cleaning up the streets, and how even the children, when you had the drunks in the neighborhood, you know, they would embarrass them by whooping their ass. You know what I'm saying? Right? Really putting hands on them because of the fact that they understood that their revolution had to be about some discipline. So to me, revolutionary nationalism is a discipline. It is a natural function in movement and struggle. You know what I mean? It's not like a man said, it's not a tea party. You know what I mean? Because of the fact when you say you're a revolutionary nationalist, it automatically means that you're against nonviolence. It means that you're down to get down with whatever needs to take place. Think of George Jackson, you know what I mean? A political prisoner who politicized himself behind the walls. You know what I mean? Where he was thrown away and folks forgot about him and they thought that, as Bach said, he was the rose that grew through concrete. You know what I mean? So that's kind of how I see it.
I just want to add though, it's not that you're against nonviolence, it's that you are not principally nonviolent.
Absolutely.
Right? Because
It's just a tactic among many.
Exactly.
I unite with that.
Period.
Next word, gender.
Layla, go. Run it. We have no time to lose.
I mean, I don't know. There are various ways to think about the ways we understand gender as a particular kind of outward performance that is associated in some cases with the sex that we were assigned at birth. But I think primarily gender, the way we understand it in a social material kind of way, is about divisions of labor, right? And the types of work that women are understood to do and the types of work that men are understood to do. But what's more important about that is not the type of work that we do, but the value then assigned to the type of work that people do based on those gender categories, right? So, you know, I mean, and but I also think that the stage of technology that we're at completely matters, because we're not at a time where because women, cis women give birth to children, they're the only people that can be responsible for babies from birth, because we are at a technological stage in human development where babies can survive with the care of their fathers, the male gendered people. That doesn't mean that breastfeeding is not a healthy or important way to start a child's life, but that it is possible to rear a healthy child in this particular way without this, right? And so I think for me the main thing in thinking about gender is less about the sort of male-female dynamic, but for me it's more about understanding the value that we assign to the roles that people play based on the genders that they either are assigned or identify with.
And yeah, I think in many cultures, gender is many cultures outside of this bullshit.
Yeah.
Gender is really defined in terms of energies. We can think about cultures that define femininity, for instance, in terms of contraction, and masculinity in terms of expansion. We can think about the fact that there are many cultures that believe that gender is a spectrum, because many cultures do believe that, and that those are energies that can exist in different quantities within the same individual. They can shift over a lifetime, and those do directly feed into the roles that people play within the society, but they're not necessarily biologically determined or constituted. And so biology equaling gender is definitely a Western concept. It's definitely something we're wrestling with greatly right now. But I think for me, gender is much easier to understand if I think about, let me look at the energy that this human is presenting, where they are comfortable, and how does that feed into the roles that they naturally gravitate to and are oriented toward, and that play to their strengths as a human. Yeah, I think that's where we should maybe think about. We should look at that.
The only thing I want to add is also that that it's important to recognize that as people exist along a gender continuum, again, it's about the values assigned to it, right? It's about the way society at large responds to these things. And so there's a difference between recognizing that multiple variations of genders have existed all throughout lifetime, and there's a difference between saying that certain manifestations of gender don't deserve to live in particular kinds of ways. And I think that that's kind of the issues that we're struggling with even more at this moment.
Agreed. Next key word, dual power. I don't know.
Waiting for Sharice, I think.
I mean, she did a little shoulder shit.
Yeah.
No, well,
Just getting ready for it.
no, well, when I think about dual power, I think about community movement builders. So that being said, Kamal, when you please enlighten us.
My understanding of dual power, I'll say it that way, and some of it does come out of the Russian Revolution and Lenin, is the concept of not only taking over the state, but actually having outside institutions that the people control that can either put pressure on the state and or not rely on the state for the everyday needs of the people. So within the context of the work that we do, dual power means fighting against the state apparatus, the capitalist apparatus, but it's not thinking that the total overthrow of the state is all that we put our energies into, that at the same time we're battling the state, we're creating those institutions, organizations, those areas or those needs that we need to meet for people and to organize with people so that we're prepared to take care of ourselves, because the state struggle can be a long struggle, as we all know. And in the meantime, we have to win hearts and minds. And I think every revolutionary struggle, whether they've called them service programs or different types of names, survival programs, pending revolution programs have always engaged in dual power activities, and we do ourselves a disservice, in my humble opinion, when we don't sort of analyze what a revolutionary struggle is and only think that by making policy change of some kind that we're going to do something to really change the conditions of our people.
That's like the key ingredients in nation building as a whole. You can't nation building if you're just looking to destroy. You got to build and destroy. You got to replace this system with something that's concrete. So I think that it's imperative.
Yeah, we must be creators and destroyers. All right.
Absolutely.
Hegemony or hegemony.
Not quite.
Jared.
Just power and dominance over, by one group over another. In this context, hegemony is what we struggle against. We don't have it. We are suffering, at the will of those who do. That's just as simple. It's just power. Who is in control? Who is dominant? Who is setting the narrative, setting the definitions for these kinds of terms? And also, I think importantly, in terms of the work we do collectively, it's hegemony that sets the terms of the struggle and tries to tell people, no, you can be over here, voting for Biden and watching, whatever. But we want to offer something else to say, no. We want to redefine the terms on which we struggle and create something new. So anyway, that's simply put how I see it.
Yeah, when I think about hegemony, I always think about the invisibility of it, the ways in the ways that hegemony. Oh, I didn't even have anything left. The ways hegemony creates this false universality or normalizing things to the degree that people can't even see that our experiences, even our struggle, can be curated in a sense. Like we must have a permit to go out and do this protest because we're still actually capitulating to a hegemonic structure. So I think that there's an invisibility.
And not just
to
a
it.
permit, you can only march here.
Right,
You can only stand here. You can't go here. You can't say, all
it's
that kind of
the water you're swimming in.
So hegemony, it comes from a theorist called Antonio Gramsci. That's where most people get the term of hegemony. And then others encounter it through Stuart Hall, particularly this article, Race, Articulation, and Society Structure and Dominance. But I think one of the key things about hegemony is that it's not coercion, right? It's manufactured consent. And so to this point about permits, it's not only that you have to follow follow these particular protocols, but that becomes the way that we even understand and come to know what protest and what struggle means. And so there's this whole thing about war position and war maneuver, but essentially like hegemony is the corollary to like brute force, right? Because hegemonic power doesn't have to result to brute force until there's a crisis of legitimacy, and that's when the militarism and the brute force comes out. So
Important.
Well put, Professor.
Yes. All right.
books and shit, feel me?
All right. Marxism.
You know you're gonna
That's
take
your
that.
bag.
Word.
Can you go ahead with
Just go ahead and do it.
Roll out the books.
You already
Marxism.
knew.
Yes.
I just want to share, democratize the conversation.
We're gonna jump in.
So Marxism, Marxism, I guess, is an umbrella term for both scientific socialism and then the combination of historical and dialectical materialism. So it comes from this idea of Karl Marx, right? So Marxism is based on this guy Karl Marx, although he was not a Marxist. He always said Karl, And so it's basically a way of understanding history and understanding struggle that is rooted in the idea that history moves forward through the clash of classes. Basically, that the foundation of history is class struggle. I am less interested in like orthodox Marxism and more of the ways in which African people have taken up various iterations of Marxism in real time and have articulated to their historical and material conditions. And so basically it's a philosophy of struggle. It's a science of history.
If you don't mind, you use historical and dialectical materialism, and we're talking to an audience that doesn't really understand.
Layla, go.
you.
I guess he's saying, can we break that down even further?
We need to.
So basically, so there's this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That's not actually what dialectical materialism. It's just the idea that there is a whole that's constituted by parts that are in contention, antagonism with each other, and that there are new forms that are created based on the interplay of these different dynamics. And it's not just two; it's multiple.
Exactly.
And so it's not. There's no linear progress of history. It's about a clash and contention of forces, and that is what drives history and drives evolution and change. We see it in nature, and we also see it in society. So it's a way of the way that social structures and history moves forward. That's the best I can explain it.
And I think for historical materialism, it's about reading what contributes to these things in a particular kind of way, right? So it's not necessarily about this sort, like you talk about ideation. It's not necessarily about just ideas or these sort of philosophical kinds of debates, but it is about a particular kind of concrete material type of reality. Literally a historical material reality that allows us to draw certain types of conclusions, which I don't know if it actually came up when we were talking, but this is what helps us understand the difference between a utopian, idealistic kind of socialism versus a scientific socialism, right? Which is about what that actually looks like in material concrete conditions, as opposed to these sort of idealized forms of ways of existing with each other. Like how can we really put that into some kind of real way of being?
One thing that I heard, I don't remember where I got this, but I've been using it as a way to try to teach these basic concepts to my children, and it was described as, it's not the historical dialectical part, it's not the thesis and antithesis part that you were describing, but it's better understood as if we were looking at a painting. And to understand the power of the painting, you have to understand how all of the elements interact with one another. And sometimes one is foregrounded more than another, or vice versa. And that's how I think is a better way to understand how all of these isms interact to form the whole. And then we just can foreground or put in the background one or another in certain instances. If we have to focus more on race or gender or sexuality or some other class in a certain moment, it's not to suggest that one is permanently foregrounded over another or permanently backgrounded over another. It's that they all comprise this whole. So anyway.
And I actually think, I would hope Dr. Ichile will speak to this, because I think that that's also something that's important as we think about sort of African spiritualities, is understanding that there are all of these constant moving parts, right? And there is, like you said, there's no particular linear way of understanding. And even like these ideas about good and bad, good and evil are not sort of these purely defined categories, that they are relative to one another, and they produce each other through their own ways of being.
Absolutely. All right. Organizing. What does organizing mean?
Something we must do.
Kalanje.
Yeah,
Baba Kalanje.
You know, it's crazy.
It's
like
the new cool.
sometimes the most basic shit, like what is organizing? Organizing is
The new cool.
hey, exactly.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you, Jared. Jared got that well.
Even though I did
Organizing
say it
is
before,
it's the organizing and organization is the way of the world. You know what I'm saying? It's our body. It's synchronicity. It's our life. Everything in the universe is organized. We can't exist without organization. I say that because of the fact that a lot of people come along and they say that I'm not down with that organization. I'm not down with a organization, so on and so forth. Literally our physical bodies is an organized system. You know what I mean? And if collectively our body parts and organs and everything didn't work together, we literally wouldn't even exist. You know what I'm saying? If our mind was deciding that I'm gonna think about this shit over here, and your legs start moving over there, and your arms want to do this right here, then it'd be confusing. And that's what exists. So organization or organizing to me is a necessity to life. So I lost my train of thought.
Well, but I think it's also that it wouldn't be when someone says what we often hear, I don't want to be committed, I'm not attached to anyone,
Right.
this or that. To me, and I say this as a self-critique, that is as much a confession of a lack of commitment
Absolutely.
as it is anything else. People often will say that to say, I'm above it all. I'm not in the morass of these internecine battles and whatever, but they're really saying I'm not committed to any one component or any component of the struggle at all.
And that's the perfect part. That's the key component right there. It's commitment, because of the fact that with organization, it takes away the individual. You know what I'm saying? It forces you into a collective situation. You know what I mean? And if you decide that you want to organize without the assistance of others, then it's like, you're doomed for failure. And I think that's why we are where we are today.
And really quickly,
So are you saying that people cannot organize outside of an organization?
I'm saying that there's nowhere in the history of the world has there been any individual you can name, even if you talk about from a religious perspective. If you believe in Yeshua or Jesus, he had 12 disciples. If you believe, if you was down with Martin Luther King or whatever, he had an organization. What's the saying? No man is an island. You can pretend organizing. You know what I'm saying? But that's just a self-centered, selfish. What do you call that?
Fantasy.
Michael.
You can have activism without an organization, but organization is a container for organizing, because it's collective movement toward a particular end. It's a constant reinvigorizing of a collective struggle toward a particular struggle toward power, right? And it's always, that's not static, but to me the organization is a container for that. Otherwise you're just doing shit, you're just moving, you're just protesting, you're reacting.
But I also think, to your question, Yeli, if you are actually organizing outside of an organization, then what you will invariably produce is an organization.
Period.
Right.
Because in order to be able to organize, there has to be some type of consensus, some type of
Structure.
to what you're doing, and there's order, and so and that doesn't mean that the order that everybody understands the order, but there's something. So even if you call yourself organizing, if you're actually organizing outside of the organization, then you will produce an organization.
Right.
And really quickly, I want to add, and so I think the class struggle, it becomes really important when we talk about organizing too, because obviously organizing, everybody can, and in some senses, different forms of political structures are created through organizing. But when we talk about sort of grassroots organizing or organizing around the political context in which we do our work, which is left, we're really talking about trying to organize what we just sort of euphemistically call the masses, which is really about poor and working class people, and that those folks are the folks who will determine their future and their history, and those are the folks that we're working with predominantly to organize. Doesn't mean other folks are excluded, other people don't have roles, but it is the masses, I think, in sort of like the ways in which we sometimes like to think about it, direct and make
Ways in
history.
which. Sorry.
It's been your too though, because you had a moment too, sis.
I don't
recall
even
that.
really listen to people that are not part of the organization. I hear them.
Yeah.
I'm cool with what you're saying, but I really can't trust you because of the fact that, like you said, it's not a commitment.
Join the organization, motherfuckers, is what we say. Period.
FTP movements in the building.
So the next term I pulled is socialism. I feel like we've kind of already been speaking about that. We can if anyone wants to refine that, we can, or not, just move to the next one.
I would just want to say what Kwame Ture used to say that I think is a really perfect, simple, correct. There are only two ways a society can organize the distribution of the wealth it creates. It either goes to the private hands, ownership in private hands, which is capitalism, or it's redistributed to the people, that's socialism.
Two systems.
And there's that.
Only two systems, whatever you call it.
African is our next keyword. What is African? What is that?
Let's go to our Nigerian friends.
I don't identify as a Nigerian.
Well, I think you should start there then.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I shared the critiques of like these neo-colonial nation state formations. I don't give a fuck about what the British and their African functionaries decided in 1912 or whatever. That has nothing to do with the realities of my father's people, and they literally drew that boundary line right through the middle of our community, our language, our culture group, our ancestral lands, our fucking economy that we had for thousands of years. So no. But an African person or an African, I don't know. Like, I feel like this is something we have to work on together, because I even think it's un-African to try to define something like that as an individual. I guess that's what we're here to do, to sit together and think about the definitions of these things. It is a person who has perhaps an identifiable historical and ancestral connection to the African continent.
So John Kerry's wife, when she says she's an African American because she's white and born in South Africa.
Yeah, what about African?
Ancestral.
But this is what I want to add to that.
How
though,
far back?
Because Kwame Nkrumah does write and theorize about the African personality, and even going back to the same tricontinental moment, 66, Sekou Touré talks about an African personality, in particular as he's talking about Fidel Castro in this moment and the way Fidel Castro has contributed to African liberation struggles. And he says, and he actually says, is Fidel Castro not more of our African brother than Leopold Senghor? And to be it was smoke because Sekou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah took major issue with Senghor's negritudeist ideas, right, as pan-Africanists, if that comes up. But there are, and so I think including the historical material realities of what it means to be an African person, as somebody who has particular kinds of ancestral connections, I think there has been work done to think about a particular kind of political, philosophical understanding of what it means to be an African in that particular kind of way. And so, and that is a particular, and for Nkrumah and Touré, that is a particular leaning towards a type of, towards
you killing it with the particulars.
It is.
Ways in which
I am. That's fine. That's my word.
Particular tonight.
But it is. It's very specific though, because there are ways that these words are used, and there are other ways.
So you're saying Castro can be politically African?
That's what Sekou Touré said.
I mean, I think there's some. I mean, it's.
But that's not. He doesn't. But he didn't materially live his life as an African.
He didn't. Well, no, he didn't. But his argument was about a particular kind of political understanding of himself in the world, and what he put his resources and work and ideas towards.
I think in a modern framework, and we talk like 500, 800 years or whatever, I think it's clear, like everybody, the world started in Africa, so everybody sometimes wants to jump on these days and claim it's like
Word to Lucy.
So that's some bullshit. And then there's the South, like in particular, I guess the South Africans trying to, the white Afrikaners trying to suggest that they're Africans.
They indigeneity.
Yeah. So and to me, that's some bullshit, right? But separate from the political struggle, like the basic concept of you can trace some of your lineage back to the continent, and you accept it and embrace it, you are African. Obviously, I think there's struggles around something even as simplistic as that as there should be.
Yeah.
But I think there's some clear differences around, I think we could get into the lines of what's being political and supporting and growing Africa, as opposed to thinking about, who in terms of like who's going to be the gatekeeper for who gets to be African. And I think there's obviously allies who are not African who do more, as you're suggesting, more to support the continent and the growth of the continent than folks who are actually African by birth.
I want to just real quick, Yeli said something about, you talked about how the British define the region and all that. Do we take the same position with them calling the continent Africa? Because I dig what you're saying because of the fact that I don't identify with being African American. You know what I'm saying? Because it was defined by these motherfuckers. But I want to know, even with that, because I've heard different things. Some people, I've talked to some Comedic folks say, nah, well, it was Africa, and it was just so many different.
Someone's also said it was
niggas.
It's a Roman term. Yeah, it's a Roman term.
Table land at one point, all those kinds of things.
Because it was Sudan, right?
But I would just want to say very quickly, I think my oversimplification is to the extent one is identified or can be identified or has identified as black, they should recognize that blackness is African and should look to engage in revolutionary activity to address all the concerns imposed on our collective people.
I
think we just have to agree that there's multiple ways to be African, but I disagree that you can just buy in with service. Right. Like fuck that. I'm sorry. I can't be okay with that.
It ain't no indulgence.
You could be an ally
at the Catholic Church.
You know what I mean? To the struggle, you can make your contributions. But I don't want us to identify African as all struggle, like all oppression, all victimization in the world, because that's also not the majority of our history and time on this earth. I think part of being African and a way to understand oneself as being African is to really be the progenitor of many things on the planet. But I think also we've got to hold space for like multiple ways in. You know what I mean? Because there's someone who's sitting in the world, living life as an African, being regarded as an African, who is oriented to do things in life in African ways, but maybe doesn't even identify with the struggle at all and would never consider themselves a revolutionary. You know what I mean? So like, do we kick them out of the family?
But it's not necessarily in the same way that we acknowledge all skinfolk and kinfolk in this context. We also acknowledge that there is work that certain people do in the name of being African that actually is detrimental to our well-being. And so I do think that, it's like you said, it's a both and situation. It is not just an ancestral sort of material, and it's not exclusively a political. It is a combination of the two, I think.